right. Good morning, everyone. I am Erin Livingston. If we haven't had the opportunity to meet yet, I do work here with H-GAC, and we have a great webinar lined up for you this morning. Today, we're going to be talking about the Texas Recycling Market Development Plan. But before we do that, I did want to go over a couple of event logistics with you. Next slide. Thank you. So first, this meeting, like you just heard, it is being recorded. Microphones will be muted and cameras will be turned off throughout the presentations. If you're on the phone and unmuted, please go ahead and mute your phone at this time. We will have time for questions after each presentation. Just type your questions in the chat box. You can access that by using the control bar on the bottom of your screen. To do so, click on the speaking bubble icon. You can also raise your hand and we can unmute you if you prefer to ask your question out loud. If you're attending the webinar via telephone only and want to ask you a question, you can press *9 to raise your hand, and we'll call on you to unmute during the question portions of the workshop. So on a handheld device, you can access the chat by clicking on the 3 dots on the lower right-hand side of your screen and choosing chat in the menu. If you have any issues at any time during this webinar this morning, just type them in the chat box and somebody will be able to help you out with that. If you are listening to the webinar with someone else in the room with you, we'd like you to go ahead and type in both of your names into the chat box so we can accurately capture all who were in attendance this morning. Next slide. Thank you, Wendy. All right, so I want to go ahead and welcome both of our speakers this morning. First, we have Scott Pasternak. He leads the Texas Solid Waste and Resource Recovery Practice for Burns McDonnell. In addition to developing the Texas Recycling Market Development Plan for the state of Texas, he has managed multiple projects for H-GAC and cities in the Houston-Galveston area during his 20+ years of experience working with communities in Texas to solve challenging solid waste management and recycling issues. Second, we have Brittany Rosenberg. She's the Executive Director of the State of Texas Alliance for Recycling. She also serves on the Tarrant County Food Policy Council Board of Directors and as a member of the North Central Texas Council of Governments Resource Recovery Council. She is a lifelong composter, circular economy advocate, and proud Texan. So you can type your questions at any time into the chat box during the presentations, and I'll be monitoring that, and we'll get to those during the Q&A portions. So take it away, Scott.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Give me just 1 second to share my screen. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see the screen okay?
We can, thanks.
All right, good deal. Well, good morning, everybody. And is that, minimize that. And Erin, thanks so much for that introduction. One of the things that I would also mention about my bio is that I'm a 4th-generation native Houstonian. So it's great to have an opportunity to visit with so many people that are working on so many important recycling and other resource recovery issues in the H-GAC region. But also I did notice that there are a significant number of people participating in this workshop that are from other parts of Texas. So that's great to see. And so many of you all are welcomed. Saw Rachel here from her work across the state, and then James McGill up in Dallas, and then Nick and Jesus Yamaguchi out in El Paso. So great to see some of that statewide participation. So what Brittany and I are going to do this morning is I'm going to start off to provide some background about the Texas Recycling Market Development Plan, just for about 10 slides or so. And then I'm going to turn things over to Brittany, who's going to give an update on what some of the current initiatives that STAR is taking on relative to potential implementation activities associated with the plan. We're going to do things in that manner because Brittany does have a hard stop at around 10 a.m. For a board meeting for the State of Texas Alliance for Recycling. So we definitely understand and respect that. We'll take advantage of Brittany's time as effectively as we can up until 10. And then what I'm going to do at that point is to walk through key sections of the market development plan. And I'll be able to communicate to you in a few minutes what those sections are. But then as I go through each section at the conclusion of each one, I'm going to pause for a few minutes just so that we can have an interactive discussion. If you all want to ask questions about, hey, what does that really mean? Or help me understand this better, or whatever the case may be, we can do that then. Also, I can try to respond to any questions that you may put in the chat boxes as well. So hopefully that sounds good to everybody as far as the format for this morning. So to start off with, as far as what was the basis for the recycling market development plan, it was all directed based on a law that was passed in 2019 by the 86th Texas legislature. And so it was Senate Bill 649. And that directed the TCEQ to develop a plan to stimulate the increased use of recycled material feedstock. So this recycling market development plan was developed to meet the requirements of that law. The law said that it would also be important to build on prior recycling studies. So namely, that included the study on the economic impacts of recycling, which was published in 2017 based on 2015 data. And then another study that was done 4 years prior to that, which was the Texas Recycling Data Initiative. So key aspects of this plan are to document current recycling efforts, and then what's the availability of recyclable materials that could be used as feedstocks, and then to evaluate what's the current and the potential economic benefits to be gained by recycling materials, both that are being recycled and ones that are unfortunately destined for landfills. And then to look at what are some of the potential feedstock consumers. And when we use that term consumers, that would be the companies that are, say, the manufacturers that need that product to make whatever it is that they are manufacturing. And then there's a number of institutional, financial, administrative, and fiscal recommendations for both state and local governments to focus on increasing the use of recyclable material feedstocks. So those bullets that I just went through essentially formed the outline or the table of contents for this plan that I will walk through with you all in a few moments. So as far as the project team that worked on this, so Burns and Mac was retained through a competitive procurement process by TCEQ, and key members of our team included Circular Matters, Brittany and her team over at STAR, and then Retract Connect on the data collection side. Stakeholder engagement was also a really important part of the recycling market development plan. One of the most important aspects of that was the survey that we launched from June to August of last year. So the main focus of that survey was to get the tonnage data, but there was also a number of other questions included in that survey to ask responders about what do they see as far as barriers and opportunities related to recycling. And then we held a series of stakeholder forums in October of 2020. This, of course, was right smack dab in the middle of COVID. And so where we had originally planned to kind of do a caravan around the state to hold stakeholder meetings, we had to flip that on a dime to virtual meetings. But I think it actually ended up being a very effective way to communicate with people because we organized those meetings based on key aspects of how so much of this plan is organized based on material types. So we had one forum on typical recyclables, and I'll define what we mean by that term in a moment. Another one focused on organics, a third on C&D, and the last one was kind of a catch-all on the other hard to recycle types of materials. And then we conducted in-depth interviews with a number of industry groups, businesses, state agencies, councils of governments like H-GAC, and then local governments. So one of the other things I want to emphasize is that it wasn't just the stakeholder forums, but every single aspect of this project was completed virtually. I know in the past when we have done this work, just being able to get out and visit in person with people, either at their place of business or to connect at a conference, was so critical to being able to get people and businesses to participate in the survey. So having to do all of that virtually presented its own challenges, and some of those challenges were very real. In fact, there was one business happened to be in the H-GAC region that was a great participator in both TRDI and the study on the economic impacts of recycling. So we knew that they wanted to participate, but as part of the survey effort, they just weren't getting the data to us. And so at one point I called and talked to the owner of that particular company, and he said, "Yeah, Scott, we want to get this done, but unfortunately, we are really dealing with multiple people being out who are sick with COVID." So that was a really real challenge, and one that we, of course, needed to be not just aware of, but very sensitive to. So we very much appreciate everybody's efforts through these challenging times to participate as part of the stakeholder engagement efforts. Another key aspect of our initiative was to collaborate with a recycling industry committee. So these people participated in some meetings as part of the project, but then were also a great technical resource as we had questions about various material types during the course of the work. I also want to point out the participation from both Representative Thompson and Senator Zaffarini, who were the sponsors of the legislation, and thought it was great when we presented on this topic at the recent STAR Summit that they both made videos to talk about how important not just this plan is, but how critical recycling is to the economic viability of the future of Texas. It's also important to recognize that this study is very much has been completed in alignment with several key definitions. All these definitions are clearly communicated in the actual study itself, so you don't have to memorize these or anything like that. And in a couple moments, I'll let you know where a link is where you can access the plan. But I think it's just really important to understand that we use the Texas Health and Safety Code definitions for what is recycling, because there are a few nuances to that definition, as well as what the definitions are for both MSW or municipal solid waste, and then also industrial waste. So I'm not going to read through these directly, but would encourage you all, if you really want to dig into the plan, to please do so. A few moments ago, I talked about these different categories of typical recyclables and organic materials and other materials. So this is how key data in the plan is presented. And so when we talk about typical recyclables, that's, say, what you would see as part of your curbside or just what you're generating at the household or maybe at your business in terms of glass, metals, paper, and plastics. The organics are going to be biosolids, food and beverage materials, and then yard trimmings, brush, and green waste. And then other materials include a number of additional categories. These categories were very similar, but not exactly the same as what was included in the study on the economic impacts of recycling. So as you look to those prior studies, we did follow what was in Senate Bill 649, but to some extent, there were a couple of categories that actually were not included in 649 that we thought were important to continue as part of this, and TCEQ agreed and let us add those in. So there is some language in scrap metal or about scrap metal in Senate Bill 649. So what that legislation states is that it excludes ferrous and non-ferrous metals recycled by a metal recycling entity as defined by section 1956.001 of the Occupations Code. And so we had a lot of really meaningful discussions with not only TCEQ, but also representatives from the scrap metal industry about what did this really mean in terms of what we should address or not address in the recycling market development plan. So essentially where we ended up on this is we did document what the tonnages and recycling rates are for various metal types as a part of the plan. But what that last bullet communicates is that consistent with the scrap metal facility exemption in the legislation and to reflect the strong nature of existing recycling markets, scrap metal recycling was excluded from the market development recommendations. So just wanted to let everybody have that understanding. And then also specific to the legislation, there are other very important aspects of what happens from a resource recovery perspective that were not included as a part of this study because by law, this study was focused on recycling. And so very important efforts like source reduction were not specifically addressed, nor reuse or refurbishment of products. And then we definitely did not include other categories like combustion of materials for energy, land reclamation, or disposal or on-site use of material at a landfill for things like road stabilization or alternative daily cover. So this is the slide that communicates what's actually in the recycling market development report in terms of the table of contents. And so I'm going to turn things over to Brittany in just a second, but after Brittany finishes up her discussion, we're going to actually walk through the 10 sections of the market development plan. And then if you want to get a copy of this, everything is available online at txrecyclingstudy.org. You can also find the prior studies that I mentioned earlier. And one of the things I want to encourage you all when you start to utilize the recycling market development plan is to think about this as a tool and a resource for strategy recommendation. So we would encourage you all to digest it in bite-sized pieces because there's a heck of a lot of detail that's in here. There are actually a couple of tables at the very beginning of the document, even before the executive summary, that focus on how to use this plan. And so that goes through information on a chapter by chapter basis as far as what is the key purpose and meaningful information and exactly how to utilize the plan on that basis. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Brittany. So Brittany, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Scott. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the Houston-Galveston Area Council for having me this morning, and thank you to everybody for accommodating our my time constraints. Give me 1 second to share my presentation. Okay. Well, as I was introduced, I'm Brittany Rosenberg, Executive Director of the State of Texas Alliance for Recycling. STAR's mission is to promote recycling through partnerships, education, and advocacy for the benefit of Texas. So as you can tell, we're all over the recycling market development plan. Our members and mission partners are how we get anything done. They're incredibly important to our organization and to advancing our mission. They are also represent we have participants from every step in the supply chain. So we have manufacturers and processors, as well as haulers and other NGOs and local governments that need to get out good recycling messaging and need to lower contamination. So like Scott said, I'm going to give kind of an overview of STAR's position on the recycling market development plan. Our recommendations as we see it for the first steps into stepping forward, and then also some of the stuff that we already had in motion but aligns really well with the recycling market development plan and advancing a lot of its tenets. So the first thing is that on our webpage at recyclingstar.org, there's also a link to the Texas Recycling Market Development Plan if you've managed to not read it or see that link in the chat. But there's a open call for informal comments and questions over the plan as a whole. And so this is, even if you haven't read it yet, we want to know, what are your questions about it? What are your concerns about it? What kind of topics do you want delved further into? What kind of stakeholder meetings and engagement you're looking for? We are planning and have in the works a series of webinars. And if you've ever been to the Texas Recycling Summit, we're going to start doing a small series of mini summits throughout the year, as well as some stakeholder invite-only roundtables. And hopefully, as we're able to get back into in-person meetings, we'll also be seeing a few of those for looking at implementing this plan and how we can all really work together on it. Also on this page, we have 4 documents that STAR issued last week to Texas lawmakers for consideration during the session interim. I'm going to go over them briefly, but they will be sent out to everybody, and they're available, as you can see, on the front page of our website. So I'll let y'all dig into those more on your own. And an important note on this is that a lot of these documents were developed with heavy input or majority construction from the STAR Business Council and the STAR Board Policy Committee. So these are folks that were involved in the recycling market development plan, have been in the industry for years, and are now continuing to help see these steps come to fruition. So right here, you have the front and back page of the RMDP one-pager that we sent out. And this is just STAR's big takeaway, boil down 300 plus pages into the first heavy hitter highlights. And this is what we came up with. Obviously for us, jobs and economic impact are right at the forefront. And both of those were very obviously represent a big opportunity in the plan. A big one being that we are not diverting nearly as much of the municipal solid waste stream as we could. And that those represent resources that, if captured, could be contributing to the economy, creating jobs, and keeping Texas growing. On the right-hand side, that's the back page, and that is boiled down the recommendations. I'll go over them a little bit more, but this is sort of the user-friendly and very visually digestible version. So on those 4 documents, I'll go back and go over those. That was the one-pager. There was a letter of transmittal that was sent to all lawmakers, and then specific documents directed at the Senate and the House of Representatives for proposed interim charges that we want them to look at and take on. So keynotes from the letter of transmittal, and these are what we think are the biggest and most obvious arguments for why recycling is the new industry to rally around. Big thing, recyclable material is a resource per state code. So the fact that we're not recycling as much as we could and that we're landfilling those resources, that's an important economic note that has big economic impact. State rules governing the industry date back to 2006 or prior. And so obviously there's been a lot of stuff that has happened globally and domestically that needs to be taken into account for future rules. We also need statewide coordination to address contamination. It was the #1 problem identified by stakeholders. I don't think anyone in on this call right now will be shocked by that. And that it's an important piece because the high level of contamination prohibits new growth and new development. And building those end markets will rely on not only reducing the contamination within Texas, but then also probably some legislature, as well as concerted efforts by stakeholders like y'all on this conversation. Overall recommended actions. So there's going to be a lot more, but again, these are the big chunked ones. Obviously, create a Texas Recycling Market Development Center. So I don't want to go too big into too much detail on this because I know Scott's going to go over some of this and I don't want to repeat at you very much, but Basically, this would be a lead entity to guide growth in the recycling industry in Texas, most likely housed in one of the state universities, and have at least 2 full-time staff. And I really appreciate the recommendation going into the depth that it does. Also to create and operate a Texas Recycling Market Development Board. And this board would advise the Recycling Market Development Center, as well as support interagency cooperation and market development initiatives. Without the creation and the established dedicated funding source for those 2 things, a lot of the recommendations in this plan will end up sort of being put on the stakeholders in the industry, which to now, that is how the majority of progress has been made. And then other needs initiatives that are presented in the interim charge documents. And like I said, those are linked on the main webpage if you want to go over them, but it's basically a committee by a committee breakdown of ways that we think that they should consider tackling and tackle recycling and recycling development during the interim. So in addition to a bunch of series of webinars and continued stakeholder engagement, because that's all what STAR is about, we've also launched TexasRecyclesDay.org. And this was a joint effort between Keep Texas Beautiful, Keep Texas Recycling, Take Care of Texas, ourselves. And we did also have advisors on it from the US EPA and the North Central Texas Council of Governments. If you've dug into the plan at all, there's a section towards the end. It might even be right in, apologies, Scott, you can correct me, but I believe it's in the recommendations for implementing the plan, but it might be in the stakeholder section, about the North Central Texas Council of Governments, and they had their Know What to Throw campaign. And it was basically just a coordinated effort to harmonize recycling messaging across North Texas. And it was pretty intelligently set up. And I was in my previous life as a planner for the city of Fort Worth, I was a member of the recycling roundtable that helped schedule and come up with the messaging for that. So the idea is what we're creating here is a free to use hub that is going to grow and grow and grow, and it will be a clearinghouse for recycling resources. And by what we mean on that is recycling education resources. So stuff for you to post on social media, stuff for teachers to use in classrooms. And none of this stuff is reinventing the wheel. We've taken materials that already existed from all of our own organizations, from the Recycling Partnership, from other previous successful campaigns, and we're really just trying to put them to best use and create a year-long calendar of messaging that reflects the way Texans actually live and deal with trash in their daily lives. So obviously holiday messaging, we harmonize around holidays, tanglers, that kind of stuff. And here's the upcoming calendar we have established so far, as well as TexasRecyclesDay.org. You can get right to it, super simple. On the left, there's some samples of just some of the social media graphics that are available right now. That middle one, Recycle the Present, Save the Future, was part of a campaign that we did with TCU School of Design, and something that we want to expand and will be expanding next year as an open call for graphic art students and to more universities to help get involved and really take ownership of this messaging, especially since that one in particular is a Buy Recycled campaign element. And this is the next generation of consumers. And we really, want to activate them and get them thinking about buying recycled and the circular economy and how they actually have power in that supply chain. It also, the idea with the joint calendar is that these assets are available. Any city or organization or business can download them, throw it up to help advertise maybe their recycling event that they're hosting, or just a particular contamination issue that they're dealing with. But hopefully the idea being that we all start messaging together so that everyone across our wide state, no matter where they're traveling, has these same kinds of messages in their head. And so that they understand and they recognize when they come up on a recycling bin, what should happen to it. It also features a form to indicate recycling interest for some of our rural communities that still don't have access to recycling. This data was also gathered as part of, I believe, as part of this plan, but a part of a number of other plans and studies that have been done. But we're still finding, when we threw up TexasRecyclesDay.org, that was a major point of feedback that I was getting from individuals in Texas that want to recycle but don't have access to it either through their home, school, or work, and they don't really have any resource to figure out how to get started. So we've left up a form for them to indicate interest there, and that will just help us. It's anonymous, so the idea is not that we're going to be selling a list of contacts to any one, say, recycling agency, but that we can help our stakeholders and our partners and our developers figure out where to launch new infrastructure. So far, the website's had more than 600 unique visitors, several hundred asset downloads, and it's getting a really positive use and feedback. If any of y'all have been on Facebook, I think quite a few organizations are using the materials and are connecting with the message. So that's really great. And I mentioned that, but it was based on the success of the North Central Texas Council of Governments. And I think we have a couple people from there on this call, so congratulations to them. Oh yes, we're also going to be, the next meeting of the Texas Recycles Day group, by the way, is in towards the end of January. So if anybody is interested in being part of that group, I've got my contact information on the last slide, but please do reach out about this or anything you see me cover or anything you see out of STAR in the future. We love to have everyone on board. And we are also going to be rolling out a new master composter program. That's another large chunk in the plan that was identified, sort of things in contamination to focus on. A big one was food waste and continues to be food waste. As we all know, it's a really big contaminator. And it's also something that we do have solutions and infrastructure for and growing in the state. So that's going to be something we'll be rolling out in spring alongside our other webinars and forums. So stay tuned for that. This is my information, just brittany.rosenberg@recyclingstar.org. Or you can email our general email. But if anybody, especially since I have to get off early today, if anybody has any questions or anything that come up afterwards, please do shoot me an email or submit a question over on our main page, the Recycling Market Development Plan. I think that's about everything I was going to cover. Erin, did you want to pause if anyone had questions now?
Yeah, thank you so much, Brittany, for that. Yeah, so if you do have questions, definitely go ahead and type those into the chat box right now, and we will get those to Brittany, or we'll ask them of her right now. So my internet was cutting out. And so you said that anybody could, you have the work group for the Texas Recycles Day. Did you say people could join that work group? I'm sorry. I'm sure everybody.
Yes.
I just was like, it cut out right at that moment, so.
Yes, if anybody is interested in joining the Texas Recycles Day working group, we would love to have you. It is, obviously it was a group, we initiated it to kind of coalesce around Texas Recycles Day as a unifying event and an event with a cool history, since it is America Recycles Day now and it started here in Texas. And it expanded and grew into this much bigger project that is now a continuing calendar. But yes, the next meeting of the group is in late January. So if you're interested, just please email me and I will be happy to invite you to the table.
Okay, thank you so much. We are excited about all these messages y'all are sharing statewide for sure. We've been trying to do something like that we've been doing it in our region for last couple of years. So it's exciting to see it happening other places too. And where'd the chat go? There it goes. So somebody did have a comment. It says, I'm really interested in the Master Recycler program. I've conducted it here in Houston.
Yes, actually the Houston area and the Corpus Christi area also both are really active for master composter questions. So I'll give you the long and the short of it. Basically what we're developing an online on-demand program where residents, so it's a little bit also helpful for COVID, but also helpful for our rural Texas residents that want to participate and want to get that kind of education, where you could do, so it's traditionally you do 20 hours of learning and 20 hours of volunteer work. So it would be 16 of their hours they would be able to get certified for online. And then we'll work with in-person coordinators for the final 4 in hands-on learning hours to make sure that you at least get a chunk of hands-on compost learning, and then the 20 volunteer hours there. So for instance, at say, you know, most of the time that's going to be a city at, say, like City Fort Worth, for instance, they have a master composter coordinator, but there's also a lot of individual master composter groups that just exist either alongside their master gardener county group, or it may be with an institution like a botanic garden. So it opens up the doors for basically anyone, any group in Texas that's looking to get something started, or any individual, to just kind of funnel stuff to us, and then we can help get the education out there. So at least there's the basic understanding of how to compost safely, and hopefully we can get those compost rates up, but also just eyes on the fact that food waste is a huge problem in both in recycling and in the waste stream period. And it's an opportunity to recapture those resources. Oh, and I see you linked all of the documents. Thank you very much,
I'm not
Andrea.
seeing anything else right now. Oh, apparently I was frozen again. So yeah, she did post everything in the chat box for everybody, and I'm not seeing any other comments or questions right now. So, but if you do have any, I will forward them to Brittany.
Yep.
If you missed them right now. So, all right.
And I will stay on the chat. I will stay on in the chat until 10. So if anybody has any questions, but thank you very much again for having me. And thank you, Scott, for allowing me to plug into your time.
Oh yeah, it was great. I think it's really important for everybody to kind of get the perspective of, you know, what's the future direction in terms of starting on the implementation phase for the recycling market development plan. And so Brittany was able to kind of provide, you know, really important aspects of key recommendations, and then she threw out a few economic type numbers and recycling percentages. So if you're wondering where did that come from, that's something that I'll be able to share with you all as I take a little bit of a deeper dive in the next few minutes about the actual content of the plan itself. Before I do that, though, I did want to say to Brittany how much I really appreciate you bringing up the work that was done for the North Central Texas Council of Governments, because Burns and Mac was fortunate to be able to help out on that project as well. And we have great participation this morning from a number of Council of Governments across the state, which is really awesome. So H-GAC, we appreciate you getting the word out on a statewide basis, and specifically Cassidy Campbell and Hannah Allen from North Central Texas COG, who are the project leaders for that Know What to Throw campaign and effort, are part of this call as well. And so hopefully this sounds like a broken record, but I just think it should be reemphasized, is that what Brittany was saying, as far as a lot of effort and resources went into the research for what ultimately became that plan. As far as the Know What to Throw campaign, we also collaborated with the Recycling Partnership to develop the content. And so much of that can be utilized by any council of government or any city or other community across the state of Texas. You don't have to be in North Central Texas to benefit from that work that was done. Also, North Central Texas COG made a very significant investment in that project, but I think one of the other really cool things about that was that it was so successful that the Recycling Partnership, through some of its corporate funders, came in and essentially matched just about dollar to dollar what North Central Texas COG put in terms of its own grant dollars for that. You know, in the 20 plus years that I've been working with COGs across the state, I've always been a firm believer that what one COG does hopefully will have benefit for another COG, so that we can really share resources. And I think what North Central Texas COG did is hopefully a good example of that. So with that, I will go back into the presentation. So give me just a minute to get the screen sharing set up.
And Scott, while you're setting up, I realized I misread a question that was in the chat about a master recycler program. That is actually also in the works, but that will probably not get rolled out until next summer or next fall. So thank you.
All right, so let me ask you all, are you seeing the screen that shows both sets of slides or just the one slide?
Nope, just the methodology slide, all good.
Okay, yeah, because I just as far as what I'm seeing on the inside, it's the screen sharing is showing what's on the next slide coming up. So just making sure. So I'm going to spend the next hour talking about the methodology for this plan. No, just kidding. I'm gonna talk about our methodology on just one slide, and then I'm gonna actually jump into the content for the plan. So if you really want to understand what the methodology is for this study, there is a section of the plan that goes into a great amount of detail in terms of how we went about not only the research and the survey work, but also all of the analysis. There's also key information in there about what we counted or did not count from a recycling perspective, and how that compares to what some other states or governmental entities may do. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. But we did very much, and this again goes back to something I said earlier, we built on what was in Senate Bill 649, to where it said that this plan would need to build on prior studies. So specifically, that included the study on the economic impacts of recycling, and then the Texas Recycling Data Initiative, which was done, if you can believe this now, almost a decade ago. So time definitely is flying. One of these I think that you all are probably very interested in is what is the amount of material that was recycled that we documented, as well as the recycling rate. So I'm going to get into that now. So I'll walk through this one section, and then I'll pause to see if anybody does have any questions. And so Aaron and others at H-GAC, just based on how my screen is presently set up, I'm not seeing the chat, but if you could just kind of facilitate that discussion after we go through each section, that would be great. And so in terms of what I'm going to walk through with you all is, I want to first start with giving you a sense of how information is communicated in the plan on a material by material basis. And then I'm going to provide you with an understanding of what the survey responses looked like on a material by material basis. And then to communicate a summary of the survey results for all categories, and that will include a comparison to the 2015 SEER survey results, and then to let you know what is the recycling rate calculation here in Texas. And so if you all have looked at either TRDI or the study on the economic impacts of recycling, they're set up in a similar way within what is section 3 of this plan. And so you can see here where this references section 3.4. That's where this particular content is coming from. And you'll see either references to sections or tables or figures that are actually directly out of the plan. So if you want to look into that information more directly, you could do so. But for all of the material types that I communicated earlier, we have summaries of that material within the plan. So this one here just focuses on glass, just strictly as an example, but they're all set up the same. And so what this communicates, first off, is a pie chart to give you a sense of the overall quantity of materials being recycled, how much of that glass represents, and then what type of subcategories that represents. So for glass, there was a couple of different categories represented there. And then we also, for each material, communicated what our confidence level was. So when we use that term confidence level, what we mean is of all the different material types, how much of those materials do we think were accounted for as a part of the survey results? So in the case of glass, because we got such a great response from not only MRFs, but also the secondary processors that ultimately clean up the glass and then send that on to either making new glass bottles or manufacturing a material like fiberglass, we felt like we had a very strong confidence level there. And then the story kind of tells just that, the story of what's happening on a material by material basis within the state of Texas. And then the right-hand side of this starts to get into the actual tonnage results. And so this is broken up in two main categories. First off, with the survey data that was received directly based on the survey results, the number of facilities that represented. And then we also did not want to reinvent the wheel. So to the extent that there was existing supplemental or third-party data that represented the second part of the information that we accounted for in this process. And then the last item here is the tonnage comparison to the study on the economic impacts of recycling to provide some key insight there. So this slide communicates what all the different material types are. So what I just showed for glass, there are those individual discussions from what I showed on the last slide for each of these different material types. So of course, not going to go through each one individually, but that's all detail that's there in the plan. So if you really are interested in a particular material type, you can take that deeper dive. And so what this slide communicates is on a material by material basis, how many facilities responded, what our confidence level was, and then whether we utilized any supplemental data. And then what this now shows is how did the number of responding facilities compare to the study on the economic impacts of recycling, and then whether we had any changes in our confidence level. So up here on the right is where the legend is. So if it's a green triangle, that shows that there was an increase from 2015. The rectangle shows that it was unchanged. And if it's a downward red triangle, that means that there was a decrease. So again, I won't go through these in any detail, but that information is there. And again, it's both in the plan, and we will make available these slides if you want to study that in more detail. So what I'm going to show you now is the comparison from the SEER report as well as the market development plan. Again, this just happens to be table 3-1 in the plan itself. And so what this shows to start off with is that from the 2015 data, there was about almost 9.2 million tons of material recycled from MSW sources in Texas. I'll show the industrial numbers separately in a few minutes. And like I said a few minutes ago, doing all of this during the course of COVID, was definitely a little bit challenging with the uncertainty. But I'm really proud that as far as how things turned out, because I think at the end of the day, we did get a great response rate from so many different entities across the state. And so if you were one of those entities who responded to the survey, we are so appreciative. And then we also recognize that there's just a number of organizations that helped to make sure that entities did respond to the survey. And so to get to that, for the recycling market development plan, we were able to account for almost 13 million tons of recycled materials. So that was an increase of just under 4 million tons. So a question you may be asking yourself is, well, what's the reason for that? What increased so much, or what have you? And so if you can hold on for just a moment, in a couple of slides, I will show you more graphically how these numbers changed to the same numbers that are here on this slide, but it'll be in the form of a graph that I think will make that easier to see. But before I do that, we also documented the amount of material recycled from industrial sources. And so there we documented almost 7 million additional tons of material, with so much of that being various types of metals. So going back to the comparison of the MSW results between 2015 and 19, this starts off with the typical recyclable materials. So you can see here, those numbers were really pretty flat there were some changes from 2015 to 2019, but where we saw the very significant increase in the numbers is for the organics, particularly for yard trimmings, brush, and green waste, where that material is just skyrocketed. And so I will mention that when we started to see these numbers coming in from multiple companies across the state, we took additional levels of effort. We did an extensive QA, QC process, but once we started to see how much of an increase there was on these material types, we went and really scrutinized that information and talked with those companies to say, hey, help us understand, why did your tonnage amounts double in just 4 years? And in many cases, it was just those companies recognizing how much additional opportunity there was to divert organics, and those companies being very aggressive in doing so. So that's a really positive story to be able to tell. Next thing I want to talk about is the recycling rate overview. And so for this, in the formula, a key aspect of this is you got to know how much material is going to landfills. So we use disposal data reported by landfills across the state from TCEQ. And then there is a table within the plan itself titled Points to Consider when Comparing Statewide Recycling Rate and Economic Data. So we would encourage you to take a close look at that because it can be a real challenge and sometimes different information being communicated when you compare one state to another. So please keep that in mind. And then there's also a number of economic and regulatory factors that can impact a recycling rate. So we have traditionally had relatively cheap landfill costs here in Texas, and there's no regulatory requirements for entities to recycle or to report how much they are recycling. So everything that was communicated as a part of this survey was on a voluntary basis. So in terms of the MSW recycling rate in Texas, it's defined by this formula here, which is simply the total recycled quantity divided by that same total recycled plus the total disposal. So from SEER, that amount was 9.1 million tons, as I showed earlier. And then there was about 31 million tons of material going into landfills. So that translates to almost a 23% recycling rate. And so we did see a pretty meaningful increase in the recycling rate in Texas, boosted by that almost 13 million tons, but largely because of the robust economy and number of people moving to Texas. We also saw about a 3 million ton increase in materials going to landfill. So there still is a significant opportunity, and I'll show this in a few minutes, to recover a very significant percentage of the material that is going into landfills. So before I move on to the next section, are there any questions that folks have that we can help answer?
I am not seeing any questions at this time.
Okay, all right, then I will keep going. So next part of the discussion focuses on recycled material value and quality of materials. And so this slide here just gives you a sense of what is the just the gross value of all the material that's recycled in Texas. And this slide here focuses on the MSW material type. So essentially the way that we calculated this is just taking the annual tonnage and then multiplying that by 5-year averages of the values of those materials. And so when you do that, the value of, and we calculated the values for about, not quite all, but 12.3 of the 12.9 million tons. And that material is worth more than $800 million, which was about $100 million increase compared to the results from SEER. Something that I think is important to keep in mind as well is that we have seen recycling commodity values rebound in 2021 to where we are probably pretty close to all-time highs. And so if we would calculate what the value of this material is this year based on where the commodity prices are, it would likely be significantly higher than this $820 million figure. So seeing some good news there. I think that's also important to mention, because I think there's a lot of people that are not in the recycling industry who still think that recycling commodity prices are in the gutter. And so I think it's important to kind of remind folks that prices are actually very robust right now. No guarantee of where they'll be in the future, but actually I think there's a number of reasons to be pretty positive about the recycling industry in the United States, because we are making a number of investments post what happened in China to bring those industries here to Texas, and then also seeing a number of companies implementing recycled content requirements in what they want to do from a recycling perspective. So hopefully that'll provide greater stability going forward. Brittany talked. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt. There's a hand raised.
Okay.
Sergio Gonzalez, you can go ahead and unmute.
So Scott, on the previous screen that you had, I'm in the food waste industry, and I was really surprised, unless I'm not understanding that, but how the food waste actually went down from 15 to 19.
Yeah, good observation and question there, because I think part of where you're coming from is that there is so much, I think, more interest these days in what's happening from a food waste perspective, right? That's really, I think, where you're coming from.
Yeah, and then the recycling, I find it, in my industry, that it's being recycled more. The food waste is being recycled more. I mean, internally with our company, but I was surprised that it actually went down.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good observation, and we can talk about that for a moment. So key points to think of there is that it did go down, but if we back up even further, it went from 100,000 tons to a little over 80,000 tons. And so it's really just based on all the data that is reported. And so we just went with what was communicated. So if there was
and I wanted to bring that up
Yeah.
because I don't believe that you, and not to your fault or anyone's fault, but it wasn't correctly captured. As I see here in North Texas now, there's composters now, 2 composters now that I know of that are actually recycling the food, the beverage as well, and capturing the aluminum and the cardboard, recycling that. Where I've been in this industry now over about 10 years or so, and it's definitely increasing in a very positive way.
Yeah, and I think another thing to keep in mind, I really appreciate your comment and question there, is that there may have been more food and beverage materials being diverted that could potentially be communicated in this next category of the yard trimmings, brush, and green waste, if they were not directly accounting for how much food waste was coming in, especially if it would have been co-collected with just broader organic collection operations. So that's something to also keep in mind. So ultimately the total amount of food and beverage may be higher than what's communicated here, but just based on how the data was provided to us, this is how we were able to communicate it. The other thing to keep in mind is that this was based on data from 2019. So it's at the time the most recently available data, but so much of what is happening in the food scrap world, I think, is increasing on a real-time basis. And so if and when another 4 years goes by and this study gets updated, hopefully, it'll be very interesting to see how these food and beverage material numbers continue to evolve.
It will definitely
Yeah,
decrease.
I appreciate
I
it.
didn't want to show that. I didn't want to show it as a, somewhat of a negative. I personally believe it was a very positive path that the food waste and beverage recycling is taking place.
Yeah, I agree with that so much. I mean, you've got multiple cities in Texas that are now fully implementing food waste diversion operations as a part of their residential collection programs. I think those communities are still kind of the front runners, if you will. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. But then there are a number of other communities and just other private businesses that are looking to aggressively divert food waste. There's a really cool development down in San Antonio known as the Pearl, where they took the old Pearl Brewery that was made into a hotel, and there's all sorts of other really great mixed-use development between restaurants, apartments, where they tried to reuse as many of the existing buildings as possible. But there's a lot of food waste that's generated from that entire complex in terms of hundreds of tons per year. So they're really looking at how can they most proactively divert that material from going to the landfill. So that's just one example of what I think, Sergio, you were referring to as far as much more robust activity in the realm of food waste.
Exactly. Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely appreciate that. So the next category
in the
Sorry,
chat.
go ahead.
Okay, it says, why the decrease in electronic tonnage? Not as many reporting. Are we finally getting to the point where there isn't the big TVs and CRTs? Other reasons?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Rachel. And I think a key point for that is exactly what you just said, where if you think about how heavy those TVs are, and if based on this data being on a weight basis, that really does explain a significant amount of the reasons for that. But that's also where I would encourage folks to, just with that as an example type of question in the actual plan itself, that those are the types of things that we specifically do look to explain as part of those individual pages for the material categories. So any other questions or comments before we keep going?
I don't see any right now.
Okay. Yeah, and please just keep them coming, whether it's verbally or via the chat box. I think it's great to have folks chime in. So please keep doing so. This slide here is one that Brittany referenced, and I think is so important for us to talk about, and that is contamination, especially contamination that we are seeing for single stream materials. So we got data from every single MRF in the state of Texas, and so we have a really good understanding of what the contamination rate is at the MRFs across the state. So what's shown here on this page is the weighted average across all those MRFs. And so the average contamination rate in Texas is 22.4%. And that does represent an increase of almost 4% or 4 percentage points from the 2015 data. And that's really important to have an appreciation of that because one of the limitations that MRFs are going to have in terms of what they can do recycling wise is if they are having to process a significant amount of material that is contamination, that's essentially space in the MRF that can't be taken up by other material that really could be recycled. And then there's also a very significant cost of that contamination, or again, if MRFs are incurring costs of $80 to $90 per ton, those costs are going to be passed on to cities or other businesses. And then ultimately that contamination must go to a landfill. So there's going to be that cost of transportation and disposal of that material. And so that's why Brittany talked about efforts to address contamination being a critical part of the recommendations in this plan. And I'm going to get into some of those in a few minutes. So in terms of the value, the gross value of the recycled industrial material in Texas, so even though we accounted for fewer tons, roughly half is what we had on the MSW side, the value was actually even higher, again, because so much of that is metal, and those metals are very, very valuable. And I think this also speaks to one of the reasons why the scrap industry said, hey, from a market development perspective, that they were good, and that there was not a really significant need to address metal as a part of the market development efforts. Another topic that Brittany mentioned was on the estimated amount of recyclable materials that could be recycled but are disposed. But before I get into that, just on the contamination side, because that is such an important issue, before I move on, does anybody have any questions or comments there?
I don't see any hands raised.
All right. And it's okay if later on you think of something contamination related to bring it up later on as well, and for that matter, for anything, of course. But so Brittany, I don't know if she went through a lot of information at a high level, but on that one pager that she showed that I think is actually in the chat box, there was a mention that about 50% of what is being landfilled in Texas, could potentially be recycled. And so I want to talk about more details on those numbers and what does that mean for Texas. And so we looked at, based on composition studies that have been completed in the state of Texas over the last several years, what's the composition of that material as far as what's going into landfills, and where earlier I said there's about 34 million tons being disposed, almost 16 million tons, as shown down here at the bottom, are represented by the material types that are the focus of this plan. And so from there, we looked at what would things look like if you could capture either 20, 40, or maybe even 60% of that material in terms of changing the recycling rate. And I would mention that we did a similar analysis from the SEER plan, and the state of Texas actually was able to make a very significant increase. It was more than 30%. So if you look at these numbers here and say, oh, can we really do it 20%? Well, heck yeah. State of Texas just did a 30% for the prior 4 years. It's of course going to get harder and harder the more that you increase it, but it did happen in the prior 4 years. Yeah, and Sergio, I did just see your comment there as far as contamination being a significant deterrent to composting food waste. So couldn't agree with you more. Very much appreciate that perspective. Yeah, on the MRF side, that all the equipment at MRFs are set up to take out that contamination, but that gets much more challenging on an organics composting operation, as you're saying. So agree with that comment 100% and appreciate you mentioning that. So let's now talk about the statewide economic impacts of recycling, and a little shout out here to our friends in El Paso, as this is one of their trucks from a few years ago. And so there's lots of really good data in this plan. So hopefully it's information that you all can use as you're talking with your communities and businesses about the economic impacts of recycling. And so what we've done on these slides is to communicate information that's in the current plan, as shown and on the bigger part of the slide, and down here in the corner is how does that compare to the 2015 results. And so where we saw most of the increase in jobs was actually on the collection side, where there was a pretty much a linear increase there. But if you look at what happened from a processing perspective, about 3,700 jobs now compared to just under that exact number from 4 years earlier. And what that showed was that a number of the processing facilities in the state did have some excess capacity. And so hopefully that means that they were able to absorb the processing of a lot of those materials in a somewhat efficient type manner. We also looked at wages and benefits in the recycling industry. So on this page gives you a sense of what those costs are presently, and then how much of an increase there was from the 2015 report. And I think that these wages are going to only continue to increase with all the labor shortage challenges that we have presently. I saw that Richard McHale from the city of Austin is participating this morning, and talked with Richard last week about an initiative that's underway with the city of Austin right now to look at what their wages are for their drivers and how those are potentially going to need to be increased. And I think that's the case for a number of other cities as well as private haulers here in Texas. And then this shows what the total wages are across the three different areas of processing, collection, and transportation, and then gives you a sense of how that compares in the bottom right corner to the 2015 numbers. And what we did for both SEER as well as the Recycling Market Development Plan is we utilized an econometric planning tool called M-Plan to look at what is the economic impact of recycling for the state of Texas. This methodology was actually very similar to a study that when I was at my prior firm that I worked on for H-GAC. So a shout out to Cheryl and the team there at H-GAC for its long history of recognizing the value of these types of projects for the state. So what I would direct your attention to is over here on the far right-hand side, where that compares the numbers from this project to what they were in 2015. So there was an increase going up from about 17,000 to almost 23,000 jobs. And then in terms of the total economic output, it went from about 3.3 billion in 2015 to about $4.8 billion from 2019. So that's about a 43% increase, which I think is very meaningful and impactful for the state of Texas. So in terms of how does that compare to some of the other big industries in Texas? Texas has, its long history and roots. We'll see how much this changes going forward in the petroleum refining industry. So recycling is right there with petroleum refining as well as furniture manufacturing. So I think that's something for folks in the recycling industry to be very aware and proud of. Recycling also generates a significant amount of financial benefit to state and local governments in the form of sales tax, other taxes and fees, as well as property taxes. It's worth mentioning that even though the economic impact increased over the 4-year period, the fiscal impact actually did decrease from 2015. All of that is based on how the numbers are calculated in the econometric modeling aspect, and that's not anything that we have any real control over, but that may indicate efforts by the state of Texas and other entities to try to keep the impacts of taxes as reasonable as possible here in Texas. So earlier where we talked about if you could achieve those increases of 20, 40, or 60%, what would that mean in terms of additional jobs that could be created? And I think that this was proven through SEER to where we saw very significant increases in tons. There were correspondingly similar increases in jobs and just as importantly in the economic impact in Texas. So hopefully we can continue that trend going forward. So with that kind of wraps up the data intensive part of the workshop. So we're going to now in a moment start talking about the strategy development side of things. So are there any questions or comments from anybody on any of those? And I know I just went through a whole bunch of numbers, but on any of those numbers that we communicated? Or just any thoughts or reactions to any of that?
All right, I don't see any right this moment.
Kind of
Somebody
the
raising-
one drawback of virtual discussions. If we were in person, I know there'd be at least one person who would have something to say. So
Yeah.
all right.
Oh, there's
you.
a question.
All right, thank you, Cheryl. Good job there. And yeah, so did any of the data surprise us? Great question. A couple of thoughts there. I think the biggest surprise was just the magnitude of how much of an increase that we were seeing in what was happening on the organic side. I think we were expecting to see some increases there, but to see that just grows so much more significantly than where it was 4 years prior. That was definitely a surprise. And again, she's not on the workshop this morning, but definitely want to give a shout out to Deborah Kantner on she was the deputy project manager on this, and she was the one that really spotted that trend on the organic side, and then took upon herself to contact a number of those companies that had responded to where literally, and these were companies that were doing significant tonnages 4 years ago, to where they were coming back with tonnages that were now doubling. And so we said to them, are these numbers right? And help us understand why that's the case. So yeah, I think it was really very much on the organics side of things. Any other thoughts or questions?
Well, so I was just, when you were talking about the organics, and so like it went up almost 3 million or 4 million or whatever for the organic section. So that would have gone into the disposal, or was this somehow new material that was not previously captured somehow because people didn't trim their trees? I don't know. It just
yeah, a lot of that very well could have been going into landfills. And so as new programs come online and that material instead goes to a composting operation, if that material is being generated, for the most part, if it's not being diverted, it could have very well have ended up in a landfill.
All right. There's no questions. There is a comment about time is right for moving the needle on the organics.
Yeah, and it looks like, yeah. So Steve, good thought there. And I will also mention, so that work that Brittany initially referenced that we did for North Central Texas COG. So that included very extensive waste and recycling characterization work. And so we over 3 years, we collected samples from 10 different cities within the North Central Texas planning region. And of those 10 cities, we tried to get ones that had wide diversity in terms of not only things like geography and the size of the communities, but also the different types of recycling programs that they have. And as far as on the trash side, the percentage of their residential waste stream that was food is 35%. And so, to Steve's point, as far as moving the needle, that the food does represent, kind of that a really key opportunity. I mean, there's still great opportunities to get so much more valuable material that is still going into landfills, like paper, aluminum cans, and PET, or the water bottles. I mean, there's literally millions and millions of dollars going into landfills that, can provide a very significant financial benefit to the MRFs and the cities as well. And so I think those are really important things for us to be talking about.
So we have two other
yeah.
questions in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first one, what do you think are two big takeaways of the data?
Yeah, I think one key takeaway is that, I mentioned this earlier, that we have proven in Texas that when we outline, say, hey, what would it look like if we could get a 20% increase in the overall recycling rate? That's just not pie in the sky stuff. I mean, over the last 4 years, it was proven, as far as achieving going from 9 to almost 13 million tons, that had a very significant positive financial benefit here in Texas. So to me, that's the most important takeaway on the data. And then the other, I think, key data takeaway is just, like I just said a moment ago, there's still so much valuable material that's going into landfills that if we can just continue to, the term we would use is capture more things like aluminum cans and water bottles, and that can just have a huge impact on things going forward. And then I do see the next question about any reason for none of the tire recyclers contributing to the data. So that's a great question, and a very good example of how we did utilize supplemental data where it is available. And so in Texas, we were able to get the supplemental data directly from the state, the annual tire report that is provided. And so that's why, while the survey was open for tire recyclers to respond to, and we've got responses from, I think, a few tire recyclers, we knew that we had the tonnage data for that material type already from the state of Texas. All right, so really appreciate all those questions and comments. So please keep those coming. So we can now turn our attention to, so what does all this data mean? What's next? What do we do in terms of the recycling market development plan, strategy development approach? So I think one of the things before we get into that's really important to appreciate is, what does it mean when we talk about recycling market development? Because I think this is a concept that, if you're not really familiar with this, you may kind of struggle with. And so these next couple slides help to communicate that. And so it's really the defined actions to enhance the economic vitality of recycling and reuse industries. And it's often looked at in terms of what's the amount of supply of materials that are available, and then based on what supply is available, how much in demand are those materials. And so from a demand perspective, it's often looked at in terms of what could be done for strategies to help pull materials. So the whole idea is to grow demand for recyclable materials and recycled content products. So what can we do to increase the demand for materials? Whereas from a supply side, here you're trying to push things in terms of increasing tonnages, improving quality, enhancing reliability, and enhancing affordability. So we actually do have both a demand and supply challenges here in Texas. From a supply perspective, what that means is that there's actually demand for a lot of material, examples of that would be the aluminum cans and the PET water bottles. I mean, every one of those that can be recycled, they're well-established, existing, high-paying markets for that type of supply. Whereas there's a lot of other material types where viable markets have not yet been developed. And so really looking at that from a demand perspective is a key part of this planning effort. And so we took a systematic approach to recycling market development. And so what I'm going to talk through now are some of the highlights that are in sections 7 through 9 of the plan. And then after we do that, we'll move into the content in terms of the specific recommendations for action. And so we completed a very detailed evaluation of the materials, again on a material by material basis, with respect to both the amount of supply that's available and then the demand for those material types. And so again, on a material by material basis, what is included in the plan is just what's a broad description of the recycling systems that we have here in Texas, as well as an overview of national, regional, and state material flows and markets, and then to summarize both the nature of the supply and the demand for the Texas generated material. And then at the end of that, to compare the extent to which supply is either greater than or less than or equal to the demand for that material. And so this slide here just summarizes what I just mentioned in terms of on a material by material basis, whether supply is greater than demand, supply is equal to the demand, or there's less supply than demand. And so this is kind of what I was talking about earlier, to where for materials like the various metal types, established markets for plastics like your PET and HDPE or your detergent bottles, and then various paper types. The markets are there. We just need to create more supply and cleaner supply. Whereas it's over here on these categories where the supply is exceeding the demand for those material types. And so having this understanding was very critical to the future efforts that we took as part of this planning effort. So now let's before I move on to the next category, those concepts of what we say as far as supply and demand, does that make sense to everybody, or does anybody have any additional questions there? All right. So
well, there's not a question about supply and demand, but I see a question. So it says, what about steel and iron from slide 43?
Mm-hmm. So when you say steel and iron, referring to the industrial scrap, I mean, if that's what you're referring to, essentially what we're saying there is that, that's the one material type to where it seems like there is a relative equilibrium as far as the supply equaling the demand, which again is part of the reason why scrap metal industry said, hey, our markets are very well established, and those issues do not need to be a specific part of the recommendations for this plan. So Jim, hopefully that answers your question. If not, feel free to elaborate further in the chat box. But anything else from anyone? All right, yeah, thanks for that feedback, Jim. Another challenge with the virtual meeting, to where you don't necessarily know if somebody is agreeing with what you're saying, or again, if you do have any follow-up questions, please let me know. So we can now talk about barriers and opportunities to increase recycling. So this is actually a picture that I took probably, like, I don't know, 10 years ago or so. This was my son's Cub Scout group. He'd probably be horrified when I point out that this is him right over here with the glasses, who's now a 17-year-old in high school. So that'll let y'all know that he has grown up in a recycling family for sure. So let's talk about barriers and opportunities to increase recycling. So again, our approach here was to identify what key barriers are based on market trends, survey results, stakeholder forums that I talked about earlier, as well as interviews and additional research. And then we created a catalog of supply related, as well as demand related economic barriers for each material type, and then evaluated what the gaps are in the Texas recycling infrastructure by material type. So I think this slide is kind of one of many good examples of like, man, that's a whole lot to digest and unpack. And so I'm just going to give now a kind of a high level perspective on that. But so much of that is very much provided in detail within the plan itself. So what were the major barriers that we identified? So those are listed here. So as Brittany very well described, the kind of family feud style, the number one barrier was contamination, but it wasn't the only barrier that's out there. Just the competition with low cost alternatives to recycling was a key one, although we're starting to see some changes there. Low participation where programs are accessible, and then the list kind of goes on and on. And so what we then did was looked at how did each of these barriers impact individual material types. And so an understanding of that is communicated here on this slide. And so we did this for, as shown on this slide, for typical recyclables, but also did it for the other categories. And so on a material by material basis, we identified and prioritized whether it was a high, medium, or low priority for each of those different barriers that we listed out on the prior slide. And by doing this in this type of a rigorous way, in terms of what are the priorities from a barrier perspective, that was really helpful for our team to then figure out what would then be some of the strategies to overcome these types of barriers. All right, so I did see Mickey ask a question about what do we mean when we say what are the low cost competition alternatives. So that was listed here as the second barrier. So essentially that's going to be the purchase of virgin types of materials. So whether that is paper, plastic, or metal, but oftentimes the cost of for a manufacturer when they're purchasing their feedstock for whatever they may need, the cost of that virgin material may be less expensive than the recycled material that they would then need for their supply chain. But again, what we're starting to see more and more of is companies that are now saying, hey, we have made corporate decisions that we are going to now source X percentage of our material to be recycled content, whether that is an aluminum can manufacturer, paper companies, plastic companies. We're seeing so much more of that. And so I think that is going to help to overcome this specific barrier. So Mickey, hopefully that helps to answer that question. So then what we then did based on that for the high priority cross material barriers, we looked at just kind of organizing that information in terms of, to what extent does contamination need to be addressed based on different types of programs that are put in place. And so that's what is communicated here on this slide. And then when we look at what are the actual high priority materials to focus on, those are listed here on this slide. So by and large, these are materials where there are not strong markets. So that's why, if you're wondering, hey, why don't we see aluminum cans as an example here? It's because, like I said earlier, those markets are already well in place. But areas where markets need to be developed are going to be for different plastics like numbers 3 through 7 and film. There are a number of challenges still out there in terms of markets for materials like glass. We talked earlier about food waste. Hopefully that is starting to change, but it's still a number of challenges with getting that material diverted from landfills, and then also tires and textiles. So these were the top high priority categories, but there are others as well in terms of organized based on a couple of different medium priorities, including those for the near term and others for the long term. I'll mention specifically about batteries. They're listed as a medium priority, but with what continues to evolve in terms of more and more transition to electric vehicles and other battery storage units, battery recycling is just going to continue to be that much more of an important deal, and raises the question of, can some of those battery recyclers be located here in Texas in the future? So before I move on to a discussion, our next topic, any other questions or comments? All right. So Richard Abramowitz from the Business Council with STAR asked a question about what I think is the future of advanced recycling and how much of the low-end plastics could it gobble up? So Richard, that's a great question. And I'll share with you my thoughts on this, but Rich, if you don't mind, after I give my thoughts, I'd love to hear what some of your perspectives are on that too. So if you're not familiar with that term, advanced recycling, it initially started off with the term chemical recycling, but maybe that didn't really sound that appealing. And so the whole idea of advanced recycling is to take some of those low grades of plastics, like the 3 through 7s and the plastic film, and then to be able to convert that into feedstocks. And we have seen a fair amount of activity in this space by private companies wanting to build facilities to divert those material types. But I think one of the challenges that we're going to see for the viability for those companies is how are they going to source that material? Because they can get some of it from MRFs, but MRFs are not the ideal place for those materials to go. But we're seeing still a lot of that type of film go into MRFs. And so I think for a lot of those companies to really be successful, they may need to pull those materials out of the trash stream, which may involve some mixed waste processing activities. And that can be pretty expensive to try to pull out low value types of plastics. So we are seeing a lot of activity in that space, but as far as how successful it's going to be, I think remains to be seen. But Rich, any thoughts you want to share on that?
Can somebody unmute him so he can share if he wants?
There we go. Sorry. Yeah, somebody had to unmute me. Yeah, I certainly agree with you, Scott, in that some of the results or some of the future is yet to be seen. But I certainly think that there is a huge opportunity with, as the report identified, about 740,000 tons of just film plastics that are going to the landfill. Advanced recycling has the opportunity to recover. So, I think we'll see in the next few years as more companies build facilities, Baytown, ExxonMobil announced they're building a facility in Baytown. Brightmark, who I have do some work with, has previously announced the facility in the Houston area. That's supposed to be about 400,000 tons a year. So I think while sourcing's the challenge, I think it will create an opportunity for some of the materials that were previously going to China, that a lot of communities stopped taking through their curbside programs. So I just think it's a keep a watch out, and it'll be interesting to see how and if this study is done again in the future, how that change looks like in the future.
Yep. Yeah, good points there, Rich, and appreciate you letting me put you on the spot, but knowing that you've done some work in that space, it's really good to get your opinion on that. So thank you. Anything else before we move on to a discussion on the infrastructure needs and gap assessment? So I think this topic hopefully will be of great interest to so many of you all that are from different areas of the state, because one of the items that was recognized as part of this study is that not all areas of Texas are the same, and that there are a number of infrastructure challenges in the more rural parts of the state, or even urban areas that are still further away from kind of the I-35 corridor, that as well as to the not that I-35 runs through the Houston area, but the connectivity between the I-35 corridor to the east over to Houston, where so much of the recycling infrastructure in the state is located. So we had a strong understanding of that that helped to feed into the infrastructure needs and gap assessment. So what we looked at here was, and again, this is just an example for the infrastructure needs for typical recyclables, but we did this for all the material types, where we laid out what is the level of infrastructure need from a collection, processing, and end use perspective, and then kind of, as consumer reports might do, organize that based on high, moderate, and low. And then we also looked at the overall sufficiency of the existing infrastructure in terms of whether it's weak, moderate, or strong. And then based on what our understanding is of the collection and transportation network would be, we identified, like I said a moment ago, needs that are specific to rural parts of the state in terms of the importance of expanding collection systems and developing more cost-effective transportation options. I think that's where it's great to have Rachel Herring on this workshop, because she's done so much work on that front with helping small communities develop their recycling programs. So we really appreciate that work that you've done, Rachel. And then from a statewide perspective, just the recognition of needs to address materials like residential film, kind of like we were just talking about with Richard, food waste, residential textiles, and then the non-can ferrous metals. And then from a MRF infrastructure needs perspective, and so much of this is going to be looking at if we're going to continue increasing recycling efforts in Texas, what is that going to mean from a MRF perspective? And I think this slide here really effectively communicates, like I was just saying, so much of the MRF infrastructure is going to be kind of where the major population areas of the state are, which if you're in those areas, that can be a positive aspect. But if you're not in those parts of the state, and there are very significant percentages of our population that are outside of this corridor, to where there may be some MRF capacity, but it's quite frankly not nearly as robust as it is in other parts of the state. And so what we recognized is that there's a significant need to expand MRF capacity through the combination of new MRFs, as well as, and I think this is where a lot of Rachel's work has come in from the hub and spoke concepts. And then there's also a need to enhance MRF capabilities to produce cleaner bales, to capture low volume materials, and then to remove new materials and contaminants. So it's not just about new MRFs, but it's making existing MRFs that much better. We also looked at a number of other processing and end use needs. So I won't go through each one of these individually as they are outlined in the plan, but a couple ones worth just noting are kind of talked earlier about the need for additional organics processing on the glass side. While there are a couple of beneficiation or secondary processing facilities, that's one of the reasons why glass recycling is expensive, is because those facilities are only in Houston and the DFW region, so it's expensive to transport that material to those facilities. And then earlier I did speak about the need for battery processing, so that is also highlighted further in the plan. So with that, let me just pause for a second, but any other comments or questions? So
Not seeing any.
okay, all right, thank you. So we really see this market development plan as being a toolkit for communities, as well as COGS or state agencies to utilize. And so what I'll do now is to provide a high level overview of what are some of those market development tools and mechanisms. So where Brittany had talked earlier about highlighting the efforts by North Central Texas COG on their Recycle Right campaign, that specifically comes from this part of the plan. And so we evaluated 43 different tools and mechanisms, and we organized those into these 5 different categories. So don't worry, I'm not going to go through all 43 of those, but they are all there in the plan, and would encourage you all to take a look at those. And again, they're broken out by these 5 different categories, and I'll walk through some of the highlights of those in a moment. But we also developed detailed summary resources on each tool and mechanism, and how those can be used to address the priority barriers that we just talked about. So there was not only a logical connection from what we did with the barriers, but not only did we say, hey, this is a barrier, but then we went on to say, these are the tools and mechanisms to specifically address those particular barriers. And then we also determined what the appropriate tools and mechanisms and key programs would be for Texas in both the urban and rural areas of the state. So, we wanted to really pay close attention to recognizing that, reasons for recycling either not working or needing to improve can really vary from one location to another in Texas. So kind of as you've gotten a sense of from the prior slides, this is just another example of information that's communicated in the plan. And so this one here focuses on tools and mechanisms on how to take on the high priority barrier that is contamination. So we identify what are the main types of materials that are affected by this. So things like all of your typical recyclables and film plastic. And then we then identify what are those tools and mechanisms based on the different categories that I mentioned earlier in terms of information, facilitation, and technical assistance, as well as financial assistance and policies. So right there is the reference to the idea of a Recycle Right campaign, and then hopefully on a broader basis across the state, more efforts can be undertaken for harmonization, which really just means to have it so that when you move from one city or one area to another, or even if you're staying in the same area, but you work in one city and live in another, that the recycling programs would be more consistent. And again, just as an example of how we get into some of the details and how this plan will hopefully be an effective resource. This is just an example of some of the tools and mechanisms to address the competition with low-cost alternatives to recycling. So we did not plant that question that was asked about this earlier, but maybe that was a great question based on what's here on this slide. And so what we do here is to look at what are based divided out by different categories. In this case, what are the financial incentives or disincentives that can be done to address this issue? And then we identify specific tools to help with that. And then what are some potential external links to go for additional resources, and then have also provided additional analysis and case studies. So when we talk about trying to make this plan a real effective combination of tools and mechanisms, this is just one example of that. All right, so anything else is before we move on to what is the actual strategy for Texas? So same slide that we showed earlier. So what we talked about over the last few minutes focused on these first 4 boxes in sections 7, 8, and 9. So now what we want to talk about is section 10 of the plan, which focuses on the systematic approach to recycling market development. And so in terms of developing the strategy for Texas, it really builds on those 5 different types of tools and mechanisms that I just referenced a couple of minutes ago that are listed here on this page. And so through each of these, the recommended strategy is to look to overcome the priority barriers that we just talked about through targeted programs of work, and then also to align those programs of work with the categories of tools and mechanisms that would be employed. And so the plan goes into much greater level of detail, but what we show here on these slides are just some of the key highlights. In this example, focused on information, facilitation, and technical assistance. So again, this touches on what we just talked about a couple minutes ago as far as how to disseminate information on how to recycle correctly, and then to reduce contamination, what can be done to facilitate regional cooperation, harmonization, and information exchange. So this is where I would really encourage and almost challenge, with so many of the COGs being represented on this call today, for you all to take this information, work with each other, take it back to your communities as far as what can be done to make this happen in Texas. And so again, there's more details on that are included in the plan, but in the interest of time, I'm going to keep going. And so again, this slide highlights the next category focused on preferential procurement. So the whole idea here is one of the ways to make recycling more viable is to purchase as many materials that have recycled content material as possible. So these are 4 specific strategies along those lines. And then from a financial assistance perspective, combination of grants and loans, and then to generate funding via pay-as-you-throw programs, which is primarily focused on things that individual cities can do in terms of motivating behavior change by residents within those communities. And then there can also be financial or other either incentives or disincentives, again, from a financial perspective, in terms of things like tax credits and exemptions, disposal surcharges, permit fee waivers, award programs. I know in the past, these may have been controversial and maybe they will be, but there are actually cities here in Texas that, as we speak right now, are either have or are looking at making the cost of disposal more expensive at their landfills. And so, these are activities that are really happening. And then from a permit fee waiver, there are several cities that have those types of programs in place. We've also been following efforts up in Colorado on the construction and demolition side, where a number of communities there have put in place costs that if you just demolition a house, that you've got to pay pretty extensive permitting fees, but if you recycle a significant amount of that material through deconstruction activities, you can get permit fee waivers. So in geographic places where you may not have expected to see these types of activities, we're seeing more and more of that. So it's no longer, oh, that's just stuff that, say, California is doing. Number of other policies to look at. So a number of policies that are listed here that can be looked at from both a local as well as statewide levels. We also included an approach to identify resources and partners. So we evaluated what the current and potential roles are in implementing the market development strategy based on activities by 10 different state agencies, as well as local governments, and then state regional, which would be the councils of governments and other national organizations. So what we've done is to develop institutional and administrative recommendations to implement this strategy, and the recommendations follow 6 key principles to effectively manage recycling market development efforts and to address funding needs. And so the entities that we addressed within the plan are these different state agencies, so including TCEQ, a number of other state agencies listed here, as well as university systems within the state. And then recognizing that local governments as well as regional governments have a really key role in that as well. And so in terms of what those principles for an effective implementation are, this is where we get into the specific recommendations, several of which Brittany did mention earlier and will be a part of the request for legislative action going forward. First, to establish a recycling market development center, and then to have a board to oversee that center that's made up of diversity within the recycling industry. And then some other recommendations focus on engaging the private sector to save scarce state resources, to make sure that if you create that market development center, that you staff it appropriately, and then to continue collecting current and accurate market intelligence, because so much of the data, like we've talked about today, will help inform future market development efforts, and then to continue to monitor implementation efforts and to adjust as needed. In terms of how to fund this, this is not a just pick one thing, or because we recognize some of these activities may not be viable right now. Maybe it'll take some time, but we are recommending a portfolio approach, like I talked about earlier, at the local level, to utilize strategies such as pay-as-you-throw user fees, establishing public-private partnerships, and to pursue grant funding. We are recommending advanced recycling fees for materials like tires, electronics, and paint, to make the management of those materials more viable. We used to have this type of fee in place for tires. I was just up in the DFW region a couple of weeks ago at one of the HHW facilities there, and one of the folks there even brought up the whole idea why can't we have an advanced fee for paint? So those ideas are out there. We also do discuss the potential for increasing the state disposal fee. I know that's been a topic of conversation for many years, but it's something that is addressed in the plan, and I'll talk about that more so on the next slide. And then we could also look at one or more industry funding mechanisms. And then we also talk about the idea of a beverage container deposit legislation. It's pretty interesting. I saw an article yesterday where a trade association for the container industry actually expressed support for that type of concept, which I thought was pretty interesting to see. We did want to hone in just for a moment about the idea of increasing the state disposal fee, because I know that that's an issue of importance to all of the council of governments here in Texas. So right now that fee is 94 cents per ton. That compares with an average of $2.30 per ton across the United States. So, and this is all information that is directly from the plan, but this is essentially where this orange arrow is, where Texas falls. So many more states in the US have higher disposal surcharges. And then over here on the right-hand side just gives you a sense of, if you would just increase that 94 cents to these amounts over here per ton, here's the estimated amount of additional revenue that could be generated. So just a little bit more of the insight as far as what's addressed there in the plan. So if you do have any other questions, be happy to answer those. If you ever want to shoot me an email or give me a call, my information is listed here. I talked about Deborah earlier, but she's also a great resource and very passionate about this. Deborah is somebody who we actually hired a couple of years ago from EREF, which is a nonprofit organization that's focused on extensive recycling measurement research. I actually first met Deborah when we were doing the Texas Recycling Data Initiative, and she was working on a similar national study. And so, what do you know? A few years later, she joins our team and has done a great job in her efforts there. I did see that there's a question that has been answered, so thank you, Andrea, about the presentations will be made available later on the H-GAC website. So yeah, we'll get that over to H-GAC so that can be published. But this wraps up what we wanted to present. Be happy to answer any other questions and or to turn things back over to H-GAC. I very much want to appreciate or express our appreciation to H-GAC for hosting this workshop today, and be happy to answer any other questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Scott. That was great. And I am excited to go dig in more to that plan in more detail. So yeah, so if anybody has any questions, get those in now while we still have a chance. But it's possible. Everybody asked their questions during it. It was a great presentation, and definitely like when people get to interact during the presentation. So thanks for making that happen.
All right. Yeah, you're very welcome. And looks like this was all recorded. And so this will the recording also be made available on the website as well?
So yes, we do make it available if nothing has, gone wrong with the recording. So we always put that caveat there that maybe something happened to it and it won't, be able to get posted, but it usually is just fine. So, so thank you, Scott.
Yeah, so for those of you all who are here today, if you want to go back and watch that recording, it should be made available. But then if you have a colleague or somebody else who you think would have an interest in this, who was not able to participate today, that recording will be out there. So please pass that along. And if you do happen to watch this recording in the future and have a question, feel free to please reach out to either myself or Deborah.
All right. Yes. Yeah. Hopefully it'll get posted. The recording, if it's not messed up, like within the next week, I would say. So it'll be up. We do have a YouTube channel for H-GAC, so that's where you would find it. And if you can't find it, just reach out to me and I can direct you to it. So let's see. I think we've basically said everything that I was planning to say in my follow-up or my closing here. But we do have a quick survey that if you want to go ahead and take it now, Andrea has posted it in the chat for everybody. So there's a link right there. You can take that survey. It's like 5 questions, maybe something really quick. So it'll let you take a minute to do that. And we do appreciate when people take the time to do that. And let's see, I will be sending that survey link out in an email if you do want to do it later and not right now. So yeah, thank you so much, Scott. And thanks to Brittany, even though she can't hear me. Y'all were both great today. And I appreciate you taking the time to prepare for this presentation today. And I'm sure everybody else loved it too, based on the comments that I've seen in the chat. So that is all we have. So I just want to thank everybody for joining us and I hope you have a great rest of your week.
All right. Hey, thanks, everybody. Have a good one.